Well, first you need to sell the book, right? You would be a fool to write a book and then see if there's a market for it, because writing a book sucks. It's a huge amount of time. In my case, at least, it's sort of an obsession tunnel where I can't stop thinking about this long thing, and I have insomnia, and I'm not a very good husband, not a very good dad. So you do it only if you really have a book in you that wants to come out.
That was Fort Wayne native Charlie Savage sharing his advice to authors who are beginning their journey. Stay tuned to hear more about Charlie's experience as a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and award-winning author right here on Pages and Voices. I'm your host, Meg Bell. We'll be back after the intro. Welcome to the Local Author Podcast, sponsored by the Allen County Public Library. This podcast is dedicated to featuring the works of talented authors within our community and highlighting their unique voices and perspectives. Today's author guest is Charlie Savage. Charlie is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, Washington correspondent for the New York Times, and has been covering post-9/11 legal policy issues since 2003. A native of Fort Wayne, Indiana, he graduated from Harvard College and holds a master's degree from Yale Law School. His first book, released in 2007, was Takeover, which was an account of the Bush-Cheney administration's efforts to expand presidential power. His second book, which we will be touching on today, is Power Wars, the relentless rise of presidential authority and secrecy. It was first released in 2015 and re-released in 2017 with an updated title. It was a New York Times editor's choice and one of the best books of 2015 by ABC News and The Guardian. Charlie, welcome to Pages and Voices.
Oh, it's so nice to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm really excited you could join us today. I have to be honest, I contacted you on a whim, knowing that you're a very busy person with a high-profile job. I didn't think I'd hear from you, so...
Well, Thank
you.
I love Fort Wayne and love the Fort Wayne Library, and am excited to help you out.
Yeah,
So
great.
no worries.
So today we're going to discuss your writing process and publication of Power Wars. I'm going to have you share a reading from Power Wars, but first I'm going to tell our listeners a little bit about it. So this is from the marketing copy provided by Hachette. Barack Obama campaigned on changing George W. Bush's global war on terror, but ended up entrenching extraordinary executive powers, from warrantless surveillance and indefinite detention to military commissions and targeted killings. Then Obama found himself bequeathing those authorities to Donald Trump. How did the United States get here? In Power Wars, Charlie Savage reveals high-level national security, legal, and policy deliberations in a way no one has done before. He tells inside stories of how Obama came to order the drone killing of an American citizen, preside over an unprecedented crackdown on leaks, and keep a then-secret program that logged every American's phone calls. Encompassing the first comprehensive history of NSA surveillance over the past 40 years, as well as new information about the Osama bin Laden raid, Power Wars equips readers to understand the legacy of Bush's and Obama's post-9/11 presidencies in the Trump era. Charlie, I'm going to have you share your reading now.
All right. Chapter 1, The Captive, Part 1, Aboard Flight 253. It was about 11:30 on December 25, 2009, a quiet Christmas morning. The administration of President Barack Obama, the constitutional lawyer who had risen to power on a message of change from the tumultuous era of President George W. Bush's global war on terror, was not yet a year old. The new president was vacationing in his native Hawaii, and his national security legal policy team were scattered to their own homes as an event that would reshape their story began to unfold. Around 9,200 feet above the surface of the Earth, Northwest Airlines Flight 253, an Airbus A330 bound from Amsterdam to Detroit, approached the border between Canadian and American airspace. Inside, one of the 290 people aboard, a Nigerian passenger named Umar Farouk Abdulmuttalib, stood up from seat 19A, next to the window looking out onto the aircraft's right wing. 3 days earlier, the young man, a banker's son who had studied in Britain and was fluent in English, had marked his 23rd birthday. Now he was preparing to die. Abdulmuttalib rummaged through the carry-on bag stashed in the overhead bin a row behind his seat, found a Ziploc of toiletries, and carried it down the aisle to the bathrooms at the rear of the plane. Inside one of the cramped compartments, he methodically washed his face, brushed his teeth, and dabbed on cologne. And then, considering himself purified, he walked back to his seat, past dozens of the strangers whom he intended to kill. Abdul-Muttalib believed he was about to commit an act of jihad and martyrdom. This would be, quote, retaliation, in his word, for the United States' support of Israel in its, quote, killing of innocent and civilian Muslim populations in Palestine, close quote, as well as for America's, quote, killing of innocent and civilian Muslim populations in Yemen, Iraq, Somalia, Afghanistan, and beyond, most of them women, children, and non-combatants, close quote. The innocent passengers on the plane who would die if his suicide bombing was successful were nearly all non-combatants too, and they included many women and children. But Abdul-Muttalib dismissed them all as collateral damage in a war between the United States and Islam. It was a misuse of the term, since he was deliberately targeting them and a civilian aircraft. But the term was also heavily loaded from its frequent invocation by the American government in its excuses for the civilian casualties that resulted incidentally from its missile strikes targeted at Islamist militants, when the United States acknowledged those strikes and bystander deaths at all. At 11:38 a.m., Flight 253 was passing over Lake St. Clair, which lies along the international border northeast of Detroit, and was about 9,000 feet above the ground. Muttering to a nearby passenger that he did not feel well and wanted to sleep a bit before they landed, Abdul-Muttalib slumped back in his seat and draped a thin airline blanket over his head and body. Concealed beneath it, he said his final prayers to himself and then pulled down his cargo-style pants. His underwear, which he had been wearing for days, was curiously bulky, like a toddler's pull-up Pampers, but the extra padding was not intended to absorb. Sewn into pouches were packages of chemicals, known by the abbreviations TATP and PETN, the latter a prime ingredient in plastic explosives. The idea, conceived by a bomb maker in Yemen, was to ignite a chemical fire that would detonate the TATP, which would in turn trigger a far more powerful PETN blast, a compound bomb that used no metal parts and so was undetectable at a routine airport security checkpoint. The plane would be blown apart in midair. Abdul-Muttalib unwrapped the tape from a plastic syringe, inserted its tip into the seam around the TATP pouch, and pushed the plunger.
Thank you for sharing. It's such a riveting part of that story that I had never known until I read your book. But we're absolutely going to talk about your book and your writing processes. But I wanted to start at the beginning. Did you know from an early age that you were going to be an author, journalist?
Well, I was always interested in journalism. My first job was delivering the News Sentinel. And I remember there was in fifth grade, there was a sort of go learn how to do a job thing. And I selected a Journal-Gazette reporter or editor to kind of go spend a day with. And I was a big into the Northside High School Northerner, a weekly student newspaper, as one of my major high school activities. And I worked at the Journal-Gazette as a sports clerk in high school as well. But notwithstanding all that, I think growing up, it didn't occur to me that I myself would become a journalist. Mm-hmm. It was an interesting thing to look at, but it also felt like, at least to my teenage brain, that it was writing about other people doing interesting things, and I wanted to do interesting things myself. I wasn't quite sure what they were, but
right.
So that was my stock answer when people would ask me that question when I was still in Fort Wayne.
Who did you shadow at the Journal-Gazette or the News Sentinel? Do you remember?
It was 1985. I can't remember who it was now.
Okay,
sure. I was 10.
Yeah. So at what point in high school did you start setting yourself up for success? I mean, were you thinking at like 12, I'm going to go to Harvard one day?
Well, my older brother had gone to Harvard. And so It was, even though I'm growing up and going to public school, modest family means, because he had gotten in, it was realistic as a thing. And There's always that sibling, I got to live up to the older brother. So I don't know if it was an explicit goal, but it was, I did want to do well in high school and set myself up to go to someplace interesting.
So you go to Harvard, you finish there, and then you pick Yale. So was that always the plan as well, or did that become the plan somewhere along the way?
No. So as an undergrad, I came back to Fort Wayne for 2 summers and interned at the Journal-Gazette. And then interned after my junior year. I used the clips from those jobs to intern at the Miami Herald and got a job at the Miami Herald in Florida out of college. And I spent almost 5 years in Florida covering local government and eventually state government and so forth there. And then along the way, I learned about a fellowship program at Yale Law School sponsored by the Knight Fellowship, which was connected to the Miami Herald. They both grew out of the Knight Ridder newspaper chain, which also used to own the News Sentinel. And it was a way it was for journalists. They would pay for a year, in other words, free tuition plus a living stipend, give you a master's degree, and send you back out into the world to do legal journalism. I mentioned my older brother before. He had also gone to law school, and law school was always sort of seemed like it would be a cool experience, but I didn't really want to be a lawyer. And so this fellowship seemed like a way to sort of do it without incurring the kind of debt that would force you to go be a lawyer afterwards. And I applied for it and was fortunate to get in.
When you first went to Harvard, did you know you were going to do political journalism, or that's what came out of the Miami Herald and the Knights of the Fellowship?
Yeah. Interestingly, I don't think I would consider what I do political journalism. We have people who, at least here at the Times, for example, there's a political desk, and these are the people who go around following campaigns, go to rallies, are writing up the debates, that kind of thing. And that's not been my job.
Sure.
And I am more of a policy reporter. So I certainly, there's obviously Venn diagrams some, but I'm not stomping around the chemtrail. I'm figuring out what the government is doing and why, and what the dilemma is, and what the trade-offs are, and trying to find out what the internal debates all about what they should do are. And so it's obviously everything is political to some degree when you're in a democracy, but anyway, so I would consider myself a government reporter. Maybe that's a tangent. Even as getting those internships that I mentioned at the Journal-Gazette and the Miami Herald, I wasn't still sure that I wanted to be a journalist. It was sort of a good summer job. They paid, unlike internships that you just had to, needed a wealthy parent to be able to do, and you got to do things. They let you go out and write newspaper stories, which they would publish, as opposed to just sort of fetching coffee. So
right.
I was doing those as just good jobs to do, still kind of in denial that was where I was heading. But then I got this job at the Miami Herald coming out of college, and at that point, I guess I couldn't be in denial anymore. But even there, I was primarily writing about government, starting with the zoning boards, at the very cub reporter level, and kind of working my way up to the state legislature.
Mm-hmm. So from the Miami Herald, you moved to the Boston Globe, and that's where you won the Pulitzer, and then you landed at the New York Times. But can you tell us about the Pulitzer and winning that? What's that process like? Do you have to submit your own works? Does somebody recognize that the works were really good and they submit it for you? I know nothing about that.
Sure. So at the Boston Globe, I was covering, this is after the Yale Fellowship, and so I'm coming out of that, and I'm writing about legal stuff now, and this is post 9/11 too. So the most interesting legal stuff happening is counterterrorism, national security versus individual rights, rule of law stuff, Guantanamo, surveillance, all that. And so I'm at the Boston Globe in Washington and covering the Justice Department, covering the Department of Homeland Security as it gets set up. And one of the issues I was following was torture. It was coming out that the Bush administration had authorized this CIA torture program. Its primary opponent was Senator John McCain, also a Republican, obviously a former POW, later the Republican standard bearer in 2008. And he and the Bush White House fought this political battle over whether Congress was going to enact a law that would close some loopholes the Bush lawyers had opened and make clear that the U.S. just can't torture people. And Bush threatened to veto that bill if it passed, even though he had never vetoed a bill up until that point. It was really fighting it down to the wire, but it passed so overwhelmingly anyway that even if he had vetoed it, Congress would have easily overridden his veto. And so he called McCain into the White House and called the cameras in and said that McCain had won and he was accepting this limit on his power as commander-in-chief. And we all thought the story was over, except that night, late at night, after everyone had stopped paying attention, Bush issued something called a signing statement, which went into the Federal Register and instructed the CIA and military that, notwithstanding this new statute, the executive branch was going to interpret this new law as unconstitutional when it came to interrogations that the president, in his role as commander-in-chief, might decide to authorize. And so that whole fight had been over. If that was true, that whole fight had been over nothing, because Congress lacked the authority to tie his hands in the first instance. And really, at that point, no one had been thinking about signing statements as this kind of weird device, but presidents had been using them. And I wrote the first story about that, and I wrote another story a couple months later about a similar fight involving the Patriot Act reauthorization. And at that point, my editor, who had gone to law school, told me, you should go just look at all these other signing statements that are sitting there, but no one ever writes newspaper stories about or reads. So I did a big project, and it turned out that Bush had issued more challenges to laws than using this device than all previous presidents combined. And it was because behind the scenes, pushed by Dick Cheney, they had this really radical view of executive power, whereby basically Congress just lacked the authority to tie the president's hands in all kinds of ways, but especially in national security ways of the type that was so important after 9/11. And that opened the door to me. So that the stories about that were what won the Pulitzer Prize.
Okay.
And there were a few other sort of executive power pieces that were added to it. It was not my decision to submit it. So in theory, individuals can submit themselves, I guess, but I don't think that as a matter of just sort of reality, that's likely to be successful very often.
Right.
The paper as an institution selects who it's going to nominate, as do all the other papers around the country, and now magazines, because they've expanded it. And then there's someone who sort of does the work of pulling together nice-looking clips of the package, the 7 stories that are going to be the main thing, writing a cover letter, drawing together materials that show that it had impact, that other people were talking about it, or members of Congress were citing it, or in my case, the American Bar Association convened a big, task force that put together a big report about this phenomenon of presidential signing statements and condemned them as unconstitutional. So then it goes to this committee, the Pulitzer Committee at Columbia University, and along with all the other submissions and all the various categories, and they have specialized committees for each category. In my case, it was national reporting, but it could be editorial cartooning. It could be, local reporting, investigative reporting. And so those people go through the big heap, and they typically come up with 3 finalists, and then the 3 finalists go to the real Pulitzer Committee, and they pick one of the 3 for each category, and that's how it works.
Okay. So how long did the whole process take? Do you remember? Was it long?
My editor and I started thinking about, or the Globe started thinking about, whether those stories were going to be its submission before the year was over. It's for stories published within a calendar year. And a typical thing that happens is that then you say, well, I have these 5 great stories. There's 2 more slots.
Okay.
What's a hole in this package? Is there some other bigger story we could write before December 31st that could sort of flesh it out? So in that sense, it was months.
Yeah.
But the stuff gets submitted after the new year and then announced in the spring.
Did it surprise you? Were you surprised when you won?
Yeah, I was hopeful that I would win
Right.
since my paper had nominated me. But yes, I was surprised. I was just one guy. Usually these things are won, especially for the national and international category, by big, teams of people.
Yeah.
The stories are all by different people. So it's really just the Washington Post has won this. And I was just working alone at a second tier, by which I mean just regional, not national paper at that point, the Boston Globe. And I was pretty young. I was still in my late 20s.
Yeah.
So there were all kinds of reasons why you wouldn't put your money on that horse. And so, yes, it was it was a long time ago now. You're asking me to be a has-been by talking about this, but it was fun.
Well, yeah. So did it change your life in any way?
Yes. After the win, so this is 2007, it was pretty clear that I wasn't going to stay at the Boston Globe much longer. A couple sort of national papers were sniffing around The Wall Street Journal was interested, and the New York Times, which then owned the Boston Globe, it doesn't anymore, didn't want this sort of, I guess like AAA promising
Yes.
person to go to the Murdoch empire. I don't even know if Murdoch earned it yet, but anyway, the rival. And so they brought me into the Washington bureau at the Times instead as a sort of like leveling up to the majors.
So is the New York Times your dream job?
It's funny. I think it is for a lot of people. It is a destination
Right.
paper. It's probably the most famous news organization in the world, or at least the English-speaking world. And there are people who you go there and it's rare to move on. It's kind of the end of your career there.
Right.
At the same time, there are people who are the classic sort of Timesmen, and they started as the copy boy and they rise to the ranks of executive editor or whatever, and it's their identity. Mm-hmm. And because I had this success at the Boston Globe and wrote my first book, the Bush book that you mentioned at the Boston Globe, and sort of became who I am professionally before I went to the Times, I appreciate working there very much. It's a good job. It's a good platform. I like the people.
Right.
I like the reach, but I don't identify with it the way some people do.
Sure.
And so if it ever came to pass that I needed to go somewhere else, that wouldn't be the end of the world.
I want to move on to the books. These are robust books, but they are very easy to read. They're very digestible. And that's coming from I guess maybe I shouldn't say political rookie. I should say policy rookie. You make you make the topics accessible and engaging for readers. I was seriously, like when I was reading Power Wars and I was reading that what you just read, I was like, is this a Clive Cussler book? Like it just, the way that it read, it was entertaining. I don't know that story should have been entertaining because that was kind of scary, but I was entertained. So when did you begin thinking about taking your journalism to the next level in writing about national security legal policy more extensively? Obviously, you include a lot more in these 784-page books than you can in a news article.
That's right. Well, I mean, I got into this back at that fellowship at Yale just because that was the year after 9/11, and that was the topic of everything on campus. The first reaction to Guantanamo and the Geneva Conventions don't apply. We didn't know about torture yet, but
Right.
there were military commissions and Patriot Act and all kinds of stuff was happening that seemed to reopen questions for the 21st century that had been settled in the 20th about kind of the balance between state power and individual rights. And so it was a hothouse atmosphere of people giving speeches and presentations and professors assigning topics within that silo. And I took classes in national security law and human rights law and so forth. So that's how I got into this area and came out of it wanting to cover basically 9/11 stuff, which ran its course basically until, I would say, the Trump era, which closed out the post 9/11 era and became the Trump era.
Right.
But the Trump era has had a lot of overlap, I should just say it as an aside, because all of the sort of novel, norm-breaking, hey, I didn't think a president could do that or should do that stuff
Right.
that Trump routinely did is all about presidential power and the scopes and limits of what a president can do. And which was very similar to the national security kind of issues that dominated the first 15 years of my journalism after 9/11. And so I was a natural fit to sort of slide into paying attention to Trump is invoking emergency power to spend money on a wall in Mexico that Congress refused to authorize. Can a president do that? And,
Right.
Times every day there was something new.
Right.
So as far as like turning it into books, for the first one, which was Takeover, it was clear to me that notwithstanding the great interest that the signing statements series had engendered, that was really just the tip of the iceberg. It was one factor among many by which the Bush administration, driven by Dick Cheney and his history working for the Nixon and Ford administrations during the sort of imperial presidency era and then the post-Watergate contraction of executive power, was driving all kinds of things the Bush administration was doing. And that once you understood that, many other issues became clear, from who they were selecting for Supreme Court justices, which were all former White House executive branch lawyers,
Okay.
not just random conservatives, but conservatives who had, in the Reagan years had marinated in these expansive executive power theories, and so would be likely to rule in ways the president would like. See,
Sure.
for example, the Trump immunity decision absolutely came out of that. What they were doing. Anyway, so it just couldn't be done in the confines of an article in a newspaper or even a series of articles, which have to be 800 to 1,000 words normally, maybe 2,000 once in a blue moon. And so I pitched this book, Takeover, and quickly wrote it because it needed to be out while Bush was still president. But also it was these issues I'd been thinking about for years. And so I could see the book
Right.
before it was written, and it wasn't just sort of staring at a blank page wondering what the next sentence should be. So then 8 years later, it's the middle of the Obama administration, circa 2012, 2013, and at that point I had been recruited by Georgetown University to teach a class on national security and the Constitution in their political science department, the sort of stuff that I'm interested in. And I was co-teaching it with the former general counsel for the Senate Intelligence Committee who had recently retired. And so we had different perspectives, but really understood the stuff. We had to design a syllabus to teach these kids. I mean, the notion was, what do you need to know to be an educated person on what's in play right now in surveillance law, in detention law, in drone strike law, in military commissions law, in presidential power and other ways. And each week we would cover one of these topics, and we would assign readings, and then I would lecture, or Mike would, depending on which week it was. But the idea was, by the end of that week, whether or not that was what those kids would choose to write their papers on, because they had, by the end of the semester, they would know what they were looking at when something was happening and people were arguing about it on CNN.
I feel like you should offer that class to all of America, by the way.
My book is that class, basically, because the process of that then made me realize there was a lot to say here, but that was mostly abstract stuff. It's like, here's the court cases and whatever. But I also had all this access and sources, and I could tell stories, behind-the-scenes stories that would illustrate, here's this thing, and it's not quite clear what the right answer is, and here's why it's not quite clear. And in the real world, they were struggling with this over, at the CIA or the National Security Council, and this is how it played out and the decision they made and how it was shaped by these, open legal questions that the 21st century was raising, and the fact of, the notion of fighting a war against a transnational network of terrorists instead of against a nation state. It's just none of the rules were written for this situation. And that's what makes it all so fascinating. So right in the middle of that, Edward Snowden leaked all that stuff about surveillance, and there was this uproar kind of across party lines about especially the stuff affecting Americans. And you heard this common refrain, which was Obama was acting like Bush. Obama was supposed to change all this, and yet look what he's doing is collecting everyone's phone call records on top of drone strikes and keeping Gitmo open and so forth. And I just felt like I had a lot to say in that space that would address this question. Is Obama acting like Bush? What do we mean when we say that? Is it true in some ways and not true? Is that sort of 10,000 foot question that would also draw on the syllabus I had derived of what do you need to know on all these different national security issues that are so recurringly friction generating these days, and that would use my ability to report out stories about actual people struggling with these issues to make it a readable narrative. And so I pitched that book, and that became Power Wars.
When it was actually time to begin, how long did it take you to write the book?
The process of it is, well, first you need to sell the book, right?
Right.
You would be a fool to write a book and then see if there's a market for it, because writing a book sucks. It's a huge amount of time, and it's, in my case at least, it's sort of an obsession tunnel where I can't stop thinking about this long thing, and I have insomnia, and I'm not a very good husband, not a very good dad. So you do it only if you really have a book in you that wants to come out.
Sure. And
that there's a market for. So I wrote up a sort of 20-page proposal that sort of partially a summary, a synopsis of what the book would be, and a chapter outline, and then a section on like, who am I? Why am I the right person to write this book? Why is this the right moment to sell this book? I had a book agent still left over from my first
Okay.
book, and she takes it to various nonfiction editors at publishing houses that she knows. Some of them express interest. They make an offer, and you evaluate the offer. Is this enough money for the amount of work it's going to be? How soon would they want it? Is it doable? Is this the right editor for you? Maybe there's a better working relationship over here, even if it's less money, et cetera. Then you get the deal. So at that point, I thought I would take a leave from the New York Times, a book leave. But the problem was a guy who did very similar things to me had just himself gone on book leave. And so I was not allowed to leave for a year.
Oh, okay.
And while he was gone, because both of us couldn't be gone at the same time. And he was, so I worked on it on weekends and nights. That's another reason why it is, wasn't very great time for my family life. And at the very end, they did give me about 5 months off. So it's hard to say how much time, because I was working full time at the Times anyway.
Yeah, that's a big undertaking.
For a big chunk of that, yeah.
So you had a book agent. Did you have to query that agent in the traditional sense, or did you know somebody?
There was another book project that was pitched to me that I was going to team up with somebody to write, and the book agent came with that project, and that project ultimately didn't work out, but I had developed a relationship with her in the course of that. And so later when I was going to do my own book, she answered my email.
Absolutely. Makes sense. So then you landed on Little Brown and Company. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's an imprint of Hachette.
Hachette.
Hachette owns Little Brown and others as well. The paperback is Back Bay Books, also just an imprint of Hachette.
Okay.
They're a big conglomerate.
Did they do both books?
They did, yes.
You obviously contain a lot of knowledge. How are you keeping this all straight? How are you keeping your facts straight?
It helps that I'm writing a book about something I already know a lot about, that I've written newspaper articles about. But even so, no brain can hold all this information.
Right.
I used both times a particular program called OneNote. It's sort of a more obscure Microsoft program that sometimes gets bundled with Office, that allows you to make outlines and have them link internally and upload PDFs and audio files and documents and so forth, and keep it all organized, almost like an accordion folder, except electronically.
Sure.
As a way to dump in notes and so forth. I also, both times, I sort of figured out how to write a book, or one way to write a book, with Takeover, and then repeated that process with Power Wars, which was to do a really extensive outline. And the outline would, this chapter is going to be about this topic, and it's going to have these, here's all the stuff it has to cover. And then from that, you can derive subsections. The process that I kind of figured out was to have alternating sections of narrative and then exposition. So I'm going to explain, here's a problem and here's the action that arises in the real world, and these people are running around doing this thing and having this meeting, or yelling at each other, or filing this lawsuit, or whatever, being shot at out on the battlefield. And it raises this issue, this scene, and then I pivot to, let me explain this issue to you. So it's like modules of narrative, then exposition, narrative, then exposition. And ideally, the narrative within a chapter would connect in some way. At a minimum, I try to have each of those narrative chunks be in chronological order within the chapter. So it feels like there's a beginning and a middle and an end, even if it's a chapter that starts at the beginning of Obama and ends at the end of Obama, and the next chapter is going to roll back and start at the beginning of Obama again. But this chapter is about surveillance. It's kind of what happened over the course of those 8 years. So I'm not jumping around in time, but telling a story of something that's unfolding, and that raises an opportunity to explain the things I want to explain in digestible components.
So who edited the content? I mean, this level of research would be super intense. Are there special editors for this? Or, all the specifics.
Yeah, well, I mean, so there's editing and then there's making sure the facts are right. Each time there was an editor. Jeff Chandler was the first one for Takeover, and then he was going to be the editor for Power Wars, except he then moved jobs after they had bought the book. And so I had a guy named John Parsley instead. And so they're there to say, does this flow? You know, would it work better if it was restructured in this other way? This section's too long. Here's either you go cut it or I'll take a stab at cutting it or both. Can you tell us more about this? And but they're not subject matter experts,
Right.
right? And really, there isn't a subject matter expert. It's me. I'm being the subject
Right.
matter expert. Books, unlike newspaper articles, do have then teams of fact checkers. But they're checking facts at the level of like, is this date correct for when President so and so made the following remarks from the dais? Is the quote correct, or did you get a word wrong in it? Are all these things you're citing, this court case, blah blah blah? Are you? So it's still not sort of conceptual fact checking. It's just sort of granular fact checking, and then they just rely on you, the author, to hopefully get the analysis right,
Right.
because that's not they write books, produce books about every topic under the sun. They don't have in-house experts.
You know these people you're writing about. Is it hard to write about the presidency so authentically? I mean, are you walking a fine line?
I don't know the president himself. Other than like shaking hands at some
Right.
reception, I've never met
Spoke.
Obama in any substantive way, or Biden or whatever. I know the people that work for them. I know their lawyers. I know their chiefs of staff. I know that kind of people who are the people
Okay.
who are really doing government day to day. Yes, and it's not just about writing books, even writing newspaper articles. You need to meet these people and have them talk to you when there's something going on that you want to ask them about, which they may or may not do on any given day, but you need to maintain, cordial human relations with them so that the next time maybe they will.
Sure.
At the same time, they're fighting with each other, and sometimes they screw up, and it's your job as a journalist to honestly portray what's happening.
Yeah.
And if that's what's happening is that so-and-so screwed up, or so-and-so is mad at so-and-so, and they each hate each other, or they had this meeting and someone blew their stack and unprofessionally stormed out or whatever. That's what happened. And the hope, you can't pull your punches, because to what end at that point? The whole point of journalism is to
Yeah,
recount what happened.
sure.
And so if someone gets mad and doesn't return your phone calls for a few months or something, so be it.
Okay. So, do the attacks against media ever bother you? I mean, I know some people who blame everything on the media. So, why do you think some people are so quick to blame the media?
Yeah, there's been a concerted effort by Trump in particular, but the right, to discredit the mainstream media, and to, in part, which is defensive. It's like, well, people don't believe them anymore. Then when they write this investigative article that says this corrupt thing is happening, I can just say it's fake news,
Right.
and not suffer consequences from it. The left, though, also enjoys bashing the New York Times as much as the right. I'm not sure everyone realizes that. In the era of social media, there's quite a lot of venom that just, as a matter of course, and the Trump era stirs up a lot of emotions, and people sort of vent at the reporters who are trying to write about it. And of course, the media is not perfect and screws up sometimes, and that provides fodder for categorical condemnation. It's not just you screwed up this one thing, but you are a liar.
Right.
Period. So you have to grow a thick skin in the same way that you have to, that writing about these people, some of whom are your sources, and honestly accounting when they screw up or whatever they may bristle at, it comes with the territory, especially in the social media era, especially in the Trump era, that people are going to tweet nasty crap at you, and after a while it just kind of rolls off, because it's just the noise that is part of the job.
Is there unbiased news?
Yeah, well, so there's multiple issues there. One is, what does the opinion side of the paper do? And this is always a problem for those of us on the newsroom side. We are two different operations that report to two different bosses, but get bundled together.
Oh, that's interesting.
And the newsroom side is in the business of going out and figuring out what's going on in the world and explaining it to people. and the opinion side is in the business of offering takes. And sometimes they are trying to balance it with here's a conservative columnist next to a liberal columnist. But then there's also the house editorial, which is unassigned and is supposed to be the institution's voice weighing in on something. And to be honest, and so you can't balance that. It's just this is the Washington Post endorses blah blah, and I actually hate that. I think that people enjoy having columns and stuff bundled with their newspaper. House editorials, like the people, there's 5 or 6 people or 10 people, depending on the size of the paper, who are on editorial boards and write these things. And no one really understands that. It's just these 10 people have gotten together and decided this is what they were going to say, kind of piggybacking on the brand of the paper that's created by the newsroom. And then people just impute to the newsroom, oh, you have this opinion because these random people who didn't put their name on the thing said, we're for this or we're against that. So if I controlled the world, there would be no unsigned editorials. Still it's fine to have an opinion as long as you have your name on it. And it's labeled as such, even though people, I think, still have trouble, especially like on websites. You might have an opinion column sitting next to, a news article on the New York Times homepage, and that's probably confusing to people too.
Okay.
The Post had a bad situation where for years they've endorsed candidates, and they were getting ready to endorse Kamala Harris. No surprise. And they'd already written the thing, and Jeff Bezos killed it. And then there was this sort of story that they had decided they shouldn't be in the business of endorsing candidates anymore. But which is probably good. Maybe who needs a newspaper endorsement to know whether they like Donald Trump or like Kamala Harris?
Right.
Like, no one needs that. Where you need it is local and state races, where you might not know what's the difference between these names you've never heard of for school board or for city council or something. That's when it could have value. It doesn't have any value for president. Nevertheless, they had always done it, and it was 2 weeks out, and it was like the worst possible time and the worst possible way to yank it, because it looked like Bezos was just sort of preemptively surrendering and sucking up to Trump. And it pissed a lot of people off.
Yeah,
so a lot of liberals quit their subscriptions to the Post at that point. That's not why people have quit the Times, if they have, because the Times endorsed Harris, as they always had, and no surprise that the liberal editorial board would do that.
Sure. So do you ever worry that you're going to make the wrong person angry? I mean, there's some crazy folks in the world.
Well, I mean, yes, there are crazy folks in the world. So, I don't sit around worrying about it. But there's some person assassinated this insurance executive in New York yesterday. It's crazy, right? Stuff happens, and we are a huge country, and lots of guns, and people with mental illness therefore have access to guns, and therefore things like that happen.
Right.
Well, I don't know if that was mental illness. I don't mean that specifically, but you have to live your life, right?
Yeah, it's true. So I'm going to move into a couple of fun questions here. So in all of your writing, what are you proudest of?
Oh, I'm definitely the most proud of Power Wars. And it's interesting because it didn't sell as well as Takeover. Takeover briefly was on the bestseller lists, and Power Wars was not. I think part of the reason is Power Wars is very long. And in retrospect, maybe I should have broken it into 2 or 3 books. But one of the problems was coming out of that class I talked about, I wanted to show how all these different things connected, and what was happening with surveillance married up to what was happening with Guantanamo, married up with what was happening with leak investigations. And so it all needed to be together, so you had this sort of comprehensive picture of this web of interrelated national security legal stuff. But the result was it's a long book. And you don't actually have to read it straight through, but I think even just like in a bookstore, you're looking at this fat spine, you're like, is this what I want to tackle? Nevertheless, I feel like that's more than anything else, at least to this point in my career, my contribution, and will, hopefully, people still all the time, even if it's not like selling like a beach read, are using it in class. It's been out 8 years now, and it's assigned in college classes all the time, and people talk to me about like how they can't find anything like it anywhere else, where
Right.
it's like one-stop shopping of everything you need to know about this or that or the other thing, even with the years that have passed since then. And so,
It is a great, it's kind of like a great reference book when you want to read up about something specific.
even I use it as a reference book because once again, you can't hold all this stuff in your head. It's like, what was happening with that guy in Libya? And then they were debating what to do with him when he was on the boat. It's relevant again now.
Right.
And rather than Googling it, I can just find that 1,000-word section.
Look in your
my
own
book
book.
and be like, oh yes, yes.
Absolutely. So, aside from policy, is there anything else you really enjoy writing about? I just saw, well, not that you enjoy writing about this, but I did see this recently. My coworker. Book review.
Yeah, so you're holding up for listeners book reviews. I get commissioned by a couple times a year by publications like the New York Review of Books or the New Republic, a couple others to write a book review. And those aren't really reviews in the sense of here's what's in the book, but what they were looking for is 3,000 or 4,000 word essays that sort of start with the book and think about things and guide the reader through thinking about those things too. And those are definitely they're a lot harder to write. They take a lot longer to write than just like this happened yesterday, but they do feel more enduring and more useful. I another thing that sort of I'm proud of that has nothing to do with any of this, but has to do with Fort Wayne was a few years ago, I wrote a long magazine project about Fort Wayne and the culture war fight over the creation of Mad Anthony Wayne Day by the city council, and it got me into sort of digging much deeper into the history of the region and the town, stuff that we were never taught in school growing up. And I ended up going out to Oklahoma and hanging out for a while with the Miami tribe, which could obviously been here until they were forcibly deported in the mid 19th century. They were the chief adversaries of Wayne. Yeah, so it doesn't always have to be 9/11-y stuff or presidential stuff or Washington stuff. I get interested in things, and one of the joys of doing this for a living is it's permission slip to go dig deep and call people and read books and try to master something and then synthesize it into something that's useful to others as well.
Absolutely. So I have to say, I read your 1995 Journal Gazette article, Dark Side of the Rainbow. And I'd never heard of this phenomenon, and I was talking to Kay, the sound engineer, about it beforehand, and she actually had heard of it. So for those who don't know, it's Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon in 1939 film Wizard of Oz without sound, and you listen to the music as you watch the movie, but you have to start it when the lion roars.
Right.
So how did you learn about this phenomenon? Seriously, I'd never heard of it. I want to do it now.
Yeah, it's a weird thing. I'll tell you in a second, but also as a setup. This is an oddity that as a college freshman I came across on the early internet. I didn't invent it.
Right.
And then after that first internship I did at the Journal Gazette, so in summer of '95, I was working for a lifestyles, like Generation X lifestyles page, and you just had to pitch stories to the editor, and it was supposed to be stuff that would appeal to young people and make them want to read the paper. Of course, people who were young in 1995 are not people who are young today. But
I can attest to that.
And I pitched it. So I pitched it and wrote it, and it's just whatever, moved on. But it turned out that this thing gradually grew into a which I didn't invent. It was around before me, but sort of in a much more on the fringes way. It gradually grew into a thing that received mainstream attention. Like, within a couple of years, big papers had written about it, and big rock stations were talking about it, and MTV News did a segment on it. And to this day, it comes up all the time. Yeah, and when Roger Waters goes to Joe Rogan's podcast, Joe Rogan says, "I got to ask you about this thing," and
they talked about it. Okay.
Because no one knows its origin, that article has become a stand-in for its origin. It's just like the earliest documented evidence of people talking about it. And so people then as a result, people keep bringing up this article I wrote when I was 19. It has nothing to do with my career, really. But and someone added it to this little Wikipedia article about me.
Yes.
And so every time, like I'm being not like unlike this interview, I'm being just
Yeah.
I'm going to give
Asked
a
about it.
presentation on drone strikes, and the person introducing me says he's from Fort Wayne and he wrote the first article about the Wizard of Oz, and people laugh because it's so ridiculous, and it's like I can't get rid of this thing. It's barnacled itself to my whole career. It's going to be in my obituary.
It's so out of your norm, I think, so people bring it up.
Correct. Yeah, I should have said. The thrust is yes. You marry these two works together, and they line up in weird and interesting ways, almost as if the movie is a video for the music.
Mm-hmm.
The tornado rises with the swelling of the great gig in the sky, falls when the house falls, etc. Not just that the music has all these visual coincidences with shifts of the imagery on the screen, which probably happens when you pair any two works. Your brain will notice, oh, look, someone slammed the door at the same time this guy hit the rim shot. But there's lyrical overlaps, constant, dense lyrical overlaps, where it sounds like Roger Waters or David Gilmour are singing about something that is reflected on the screen. So no one told you when to run, just as it cuts to Dorothy running away, or black and blue, just as Dorothy in her blue dress is being confronted by the witch in her black dress, in Munchkinland. Or the album closes with heartbeats that play just when Dorothy puts her ear to the Tin Woodman's chest because he's told her that he has no heart. But over and over and over, things like that.
Uh-huh.
Totally bizarre. There's no way they did it on purpose. They say they didn't do it on purpose, but they all acknowledge that it's quite weird and interesting. So.
It's fascinating. It really is. I really do want to do this. I need an hour and 42 minutes to just time to waste.
Well, it's really only 45 minutes because that's how long the album is.
So you just do it for 45 minutes.
It peters out with the Tin Woodsman and her listening to his chest. And, it used to be a hard thing. You had to start it at just the right moment. Now people have uploaded it to YouTube already done, so you can just go and find it. And not have to work hard.
I know what Kay and I are doing next. So what's next, Charlie? You got any more books on the horizon?
Well, I don't want to announce anything before it's ripe, but there's been some talks. And of course, also I don't know when you're going to air this, but it's December 5th. And so we're right in the middle of the Trump transition, and wild things are already happening. Things are very busy just keeping up with that. So whether and when the next book and how soon that'll be is one question. But regardless, I know that I'll be very busy writing about the second Trump term.
Yes, absolutely. So last but not least, how can readers contact you?
Well, like a lot of people, I recently migrated from former Twitter X to Blue Sky. So you could @ me there or DM me there. You can go on to the New York Times webpage, and there's a bio of me, and there's a way to send an email to a reporter that way. We call that reader mail. And I think I have a contact form of some sort on my personal website, charliesavage.com, which is a place where I put stuff that isn't going to make it into the Times, but that I'm still interested in.
Sure. Well, thanks so much for this conversation, Charlie.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, next time you're in Fort Wayne, I hope you stop by and see us at the library.
Absolutely. Though I'm more of a Tecumseh Branch aficionado.
Oh,
based on where I grew up.
Oh, yeah. All right. Well, maybe I'll have to swing by the Tecumseh Branch. I do like that one. So thank you to those who listened in. Stay tuned for more authors on Pages and Voices. I'm your host, Meg Bell. Until next time. Thank you for joining us on Pages and Voices, a source for local authors and their stories. From the studios of Access Fort Wayne at the Allen County Public Library in downtown Fort Wayne, Indiana, I'm your host, Meg Bell. A special thank you to Kay Gregg for her work engineering and editing this episode. We've explored fascinating stories and insightful discussions today, but our journey doesn't end here. Find more episodes of Pages and Voices wherever you listen to podcasts. Stay tuned for more inspiring conversations with the area's authors and their insights into the written word. Until next time, keep turning the pages, and we look forward to welcoming you back soon.